The Secret Life of Dad.
Daddy made a podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Secret Life of Dad's podcast with myself, Lawrence.
Thank you,
And
Matthew.
today we are joined by the children's nutritionist, Sarah Almond. Is it Bushell?
It is. That's correct,
Yeah.
yes.
And we are really, really excited to get into this one because as a parent, navigating the world of food from weaning to toddlers to only wanting to eat smiley faces is something that we're presented with on a daily basis. So Sarah, just a little bit about Sarah. You have over 25 years of experience helping parents. I noticed that you have degrees coming out of your eyeballs, left, right, a registered dietitian, an SOS professional pediatric feeding therapist. On top of that, you've worked with brands such as Heinz, Hovis, and Tommy Teepee. You've worked as an NHS consultant. You're a mummy, most importantly. So you've been through the trenches like all of us.
Yeah.
And we are really, really excited to speak with you today. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to dig into this topic.
We basically set up the podcast to have these kind of conversations. So we've been giddy all week. We kind of been like, we cannot wait to have this conversation. And I've got a funny feeling again, just listening to Matthew there reel off the many accolades, that this is going to be a conversation I wish that I had 7 years ago when I became a dad. So I'm super excited.
So to kick things off, Sarah, maybe if you could introduce yourself a little bit more, how you got to where you are today, your journey, everything about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Sarah. I'm very old. I've been working as a pediatric dietitian for 25 years. And actually, I think the main inspiration for me really digging into feeding children rather than just the food and the nutrition side of things was the experience of being a mum myself. So I've got two children who are 15 and 17 now. But, the first one was that sort of typical toddler, picky eater, wouldn't eat vegetables, wouldn't eat meat, wouldn't sit at the table, very strong-willed, all of that. And then my second one came along, and it turned out she had an undiagnosed food allergy, and she used to just puke essentially from day one all the time. And she just grew up learning that food caused pain. And so she just didn't eat. So she had this aversion to eating. And I think it was the two different experiences of having these fussy eaters that really got me into, why? What exactly is going on here? And from there, what can I do to make things better for them?
That's such a good place to start. We're going through one of these periods right now. I have a 7-year-old and an almost 5-year-old. We're going through a period where they seem so fussy. We're preparing these meals. We're sitting them down. We're trying to sort of have meal times where we all sit together and eat. And for whatever reason, it's just not quite happening at the moment. And as parents, we can't help but blame ourselves and try and figure out, how could we start to get things back on track? Do you have any kind of initial steps that a parent could take in that situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that you've hit the nail on the head there about trying to have meal times together. That is really, really crucial. And the reason for that is children are learning how to eat, and actually parents are the best teachers because you're their most trusted adult. So the more that they can eat with you, watch you, pick up something they've never had before. It might be like, corn on the cob. The first time you see a corn on the cob, you don't realize you have to eat it like a chipmunk, do you? So it's things like that. It's just being able to see you doing it. And also, when children are going through, we call it the neophobic phase. So this is something that all toddlers experience. It's actually a brain development. But when they're going through this phase of fear of new foods, it can be quite reassuring for them to see their most trusted adult eating that food and surviving. So yeah, eating together is amazing.
You've just said fear of foods there, and this is something I want to come straight. So my son loves fish and chips, and when I told him that I was coming on to speak with you today, he says, please tell Sarah I love fish and chips, but I hate peas. He has a pea phobia. And literally, when you say fear, if there's been a pea on his plate, he'll literally push the whole plate away. If there's a pea in the room, so much so that the older sibling, our daughter, almost teases him a bit with peas, and we're trying to obviously nip that in the bud. But peas, everything else he seems to be okay with, but he has an actual fear of peas. Is that a natural thing? I mean, not necessarily with peas specifically.
But yeah, you're right. It is an actual thing. And so it's really interesting, actually. It's thought to stem from our cavemen days, essentially to stop these like inquisitive little people going out and, finding these lovely bright berries and inadvertently poisoning themselves. So it's thought to like keep them safe, essentially. But of course, they get that fear response, that adrenaline, that anxiety for things that are not going to poison them. But it's stayed with them stayed with us as humans for a long time.
My goodness. Yeah.
I think like something that I've had to do recently, Sarah, is just lower my expectations.
Yeah.
I don't know like what your thoughts are around this. Because, when you've gone, you've slaved away over a good meal, you've thought consciously about protein, carbohydrates, fiber, vegetables, and then you put it on the table and it's just a no. And it's hard sometimes not to take it personally.
Is this when I come over to have supper at your place? Yeah.
But it's really hard not to take it personally. So something that I've started to do is just lower expectations. But is there any advice that you can give in terms of how we present food to our children? Something that's maybe going to entice them to want to eat it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that you've lowered your expectations, because I think we all come into parenthood expecting our children just to sit down and eat and they don't, they're learning. So it can take them a little while just to get used to it. And the other thing just to be mindful of is, eating is functional for kids. It's boring. They're not interested in the social side of things like we are, where we might sit around and have a chat and have a conversation, and it's quite a nice experience. They just want to fill their tummies, get rid of that hungry feeling, and then go off and do something far more interesting. So I love that. But yeah, in terms of, how you can make food a bit more appealing. So there's a few things, actually. So I would say the number one thing is you've got to meet your child where they're at developmentally. So, tap into their imagination when you're talking about food. So we want them to want to come to the table. We want them to be inquisitive. And, children do have this natural curiosity. So at the table has to be a fun place, somewhere where they want to come. So I often say to parents, whatever they're interested in, we had a family recently who we were working with. Boy was a fussy eater, but he was really into Star Wars. And so Mum said, what, this pasta bolognese here, Luke Skywalker made it. And it was really just like tapping into the thing that he was interested in, to get him to be inquisitive about what it was all about. And if you've got very little ones, it could be, cauliflower sheep or broccoli trees or, whatever it is that appeals really. And if you can use story at the same time, that can really help them, because they're just very imaginative, aren't they, when they're little? So if you can really tap into their imagination and relate it to the food, that can just make meal times more pleasant for them. So I'd say that's... Sorry.
No, just saying, like, that makes so much sense. Even as adults, like, we have this imagination around food. We love a story to be told around food. And I'm thinking of Heston Blumenthal and, going to one of his restaurants, and there's this big theatre and story around it. But that makes so much sense that actually it starts at childhood as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a huge amount to be said about just having that expectation that actually they are children and they are playing, and we have to tap into play in order to get them to learn. It's just how they develop and grow. But the other things I would say as well is, children learn to eat through their sensory systems. So really be mindful of their senses. What does the food look like? It really does need to look inviting. It needs to be arranged on the plate, and you don't have to, go to Pinterest and make, cookie cutter sandwiches and things like that. But, just a smiley face, or being mindful of the different colors that you've got on the plate, so it just visually looks appealing. And then the other thing I would say with that is make sure it smells nice, because after food's been accepted visually, it then has to be accepted in terms of how it smells. And then after that's been accepted, then we want, children will go on to taste it. But again, make sure it tastes nice. One of the things that I find is a lot of parents are so interested in healthy eating and nutrition these days, and they will do things like steam the vegetables. And actually, that's not really very appealing to children. So, the food isn't nutrition until it's eaten. So if we can add herbs and spices, or even melt a bit of butter on your broccoli, or, whatever it is, just to make it actually taste nice, then once children are eating that broccoli on a regular basis, then we can start to look at healthy eating.
I like that. How do we make vegetables then more enticing? Because if it's one food that's thrown off the plate more quickly than any other in our house. Actually, do you know what? My daughter, she's 2.5. She actually loves peas, but a lot of other vegetables, we and I guess it comes down to our language as well. Like, it's like, you've got to eat this, you've got to eat this. When we kind of use those terminologies, what impact? Sorry, two questions there. What impact does that have on, a toddler or a child of any age when you're using language like, you can't leave the table until you've eaten your vegetables? Do they then associate that space with negatively? Is that how it happens?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it. So, as well as the whole sensory side of learning how to eat, children also learn by association. And sometimes it's because they've had a negative experience, like my daughter who had her allergies. But also it can be how they've been conditioned in terms of the environment. So, another really common thing we often see is parents will say to us, they'll eat beautifully at nursery, or they'll eat beautifully at granny's house, but they won't eat that same food at home, even if it's been boxed up and it's the exact same meal and you've heated it up and presented it to them. And what it is the environment's different. So often nursery or granny's house, the environment is set up to eat. There's the social side of things. There's positive reinforcement and praise from the other kids, actually, but also from the teachers. But at home, it's often negatively reinforced, because there's a lot of, please, can you try that? Oh, you're not going to get your pudding until you've cleaned your plate, or just finish your chicken, that sort of thing. And these are all negative things, and these make meal times unpleasant. And what that does is, when children are feeling that, it feels like pressure, it feels like anxiety, it feels like stress. And stress secretes adrenaline, and adrenaline switches off appetite. So it's this like vicious cycle. So, my best piece of advice is, by all means, talk about the food and where it comes from and how beautiful it is and what it smells like and looks like, but just don't talk about the eating.
Okay. Because do you think that parents make too much of a fuss especially around the table, and they pick up on that energy? Because I know I'm guilty of that. Same. Don't know if
I think we all are. I'm guilty of it as well. Yes, I think we do. I think it comes from a very good place. It comes from, we're desperately worried about our children, especially in this day and age when there's so much knowledge and information about what's good for them, and how to keep them healthy, and we really want to do the very best we can. And so when you've prepared a really nutritious, wholesome meal and presented that to your child, and they just turn their nose up at it and walk away, it makes us feel like, oh my goodness, what can we do? So I think it does come from a good place, but I think, there is a little bit, maybe we've gone a little bit too far with that.
One of the things that my daughter has decided recently, one of the many things, this is actually, a very common thing, and I think it's wonderful that she's making observations and making her own choices with regards to her food. So she's decided that she wants to explore being a vegetarian, which is fantastic. I'm there to support her explore this. My wife is a little bit concerned about how we get the right macronutrient balance, with particularly regarding her protein levels and so on. So my question to you, first part of it, number one, is there a particular protein metric that we should be aiming for with our kids? The number one. And then secondly, how to get the right diversity for any young children, my daughter's 7, who are looking to become vegetarians?
Yeah, absolutely. So protein is always the key nutrient that people get stuck on, get hooked up on. But actually, we don't need very much protein. So our bodies actually don't need. We actually eat far more than we need, more than double, and we out. So we don't actually need as much as we think we do. So if children, I've got a vegetarian as well, actually, and if they decide that they're not eating meat, you can be pretty rest assured that they're still going to be getting enough protein, particularly with vegetarians because they're still having dairy foods. If they're having eggs, brilliant. And then things like beans and pulses are a really good source of protein as well. But you also get protein in carb foods. So you get protein in things like bread, cereals, pasta. So it's really rare to not get enough protein.
That's great to hear, because that's the way the conversation went afterwards. And my wife and I had this discussion. I said, I'm pretty certain that she'll be sourcing enough and that she doesn't necessarily need so much. This is brilliant. I'm going to send her this part of the clip.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
definitely.
And in terms then, the most important meal of the day, breakfast, I'm not saying it is, but maybe can we talk about a little, or investigate that a little bit more in terms of where that's come from, if it really is the most important meal of the day? Because like when we send our toddler off to nursery, we kind of you feel bad as a parent if they haven't had enough to eat. So what would maybe be, I've had a look through your website, you've got amazing recipes and everything on there, but have you got any tips for parents just to help them with breakfast time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree. I think, breakfast is one of the arguably the most important meal of the day because it does set, you up for the rest of the day. So sometimes we find that children don't want to have breakfast when they haven't had enough of a gap in between what they've had the night before and breakfast time. So often if you find that there's no appetite at breakfast, I just look at what time they ate last. Often it can be that they're a bit older, but they're still having a snack and milk at bedtime. And actually, maybe they don't need that because they haven't had enough of a fast, essentially, before that next eating occasion in the morning. Then the other thing I would look at as well is, are they having milk before breakfast? Or even sometimes they're sat at the table and the first thing they do is pick up milk and then they're full up and they don't actually eat the food. So if it's, and often children, love milk, don't they? They can be real milk guzzlers. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll say to mums and dads, it's still fine to give them their milk, but give it halfway through the meal so they've had a decent chance to eat some food first of all. And then in terms of, what to feed. So I'm not a huge fan of breakfast cereals, if I'm honest with you, particularly because most of them have a lot of sugar added to them. It's actually really hard to find a breakfast cereal that doesn't have loads and loads of other stuff added to it. But there are a few, and I won't name any brand names, but it's absolutely fine to have any food at breakfast. It doesn't actually have to be cereal or toast or, those traditional things that we have. You could have leftovers from the night before. That would be fine. My children love eggs. So we often have eggs in the morning and, it could be fried eggs or it could be scrambled eggs. They'll have avocado. We try and get some starchy carbohydrates into them because they're a really good energy provider that's going to sustain them for a chunk of time in the morning. And then the other thing I like to have in every meal, actually, and breakfast that often gets missed out, is a fruit and a vegetable. So try and get a fruit and veg in. If you think about it, we're always striving to our 5 a day, or sometimes it's even more depending on whose research you read. And actually breakfast time is often that meal that it's where it gets missed. So adding it in just helps you achieve that as well.
That's a great. Just before I left today, my wife said, "Can you ask what happens if toddlers don't get their 5 a day?" Because I feel like 5 a day is something that's been embedded in me since I can remember. I'm sure you're the same. Everywhere you go, it's like 5 a day, 5 a day. What happens if you don't hit that 5 a day?
Yeah, so the fruit and vegetables contain vitamins and minerals, fluid and fiber. That's what we're trying to get in terms of the nutrients. So first of all, it doesn't have to be In adults, we often say try and go for 3 veg and 2 fruits. But with children, because they can be fussy and because vegetables are a food that they don't necessarily like straight away, there's quite a lot of bitter compounds in there. In my book, it's totally okay for them to have 5 fruit instead of that combination of fruit and veg. Yeah, something you want to work towards as they grow up, but if that's the way we're going to do it, then that's absolutely fine. So if they're missing out on the vitamins and the minerals, that depends on which ones, but some of them are stored in the body, some of them you do have to have on a daily basis because the body can't store them. So if they aren't getting enough of those, that's when I would be looking at supplementing them with a vitamin supplement, really, just to make sure. The other thing that we see is if they don't have the amount of fiber or the fluid that comes from the fruit and vegetables, they can end up with constipation, tummy ache. They might still poo, but it might be a bit harder and uncomfortable for them. So if they've got any sort of gutty typey things going on, it's always worth looking at what the fruit and veg intake is as well. Unfortunately, you can't really supplement that. So then we're looking at alternative forms of fiber that they might have, or alternative ways of getting fluid into children.
One of the ways, and again, I'd love to hear your thought on smoothies, because sometimes we just have this panic as parents. We're like, they're not eating enough fruit or vegetables, whatever it might be. Let's kind of jazz it up. Let's get the smoothie out, and we do it a number of times during the week. Does that affect the way that they process the food internally, or is it just all good because if it's getting it into them and it's nourishing them, then great?
Yeah, I love a smoothie, and I think it's a really nice, easy, child-friendly way of getting fruit and veg into them. If you make your own, that's definitely the gold standard, because it's literally just that fruit, that vegetable, whatever whizzed up, and you drink it. The shop bought ones, quite often what they'll do is they'll sieve them to make them really, really smooth, and so some of that fiber's missing. So definitely homemade is the way to go.
Okay, because I see, like, what are the innocent ones like? Is there, because I remember back in the day there's a thing, there's X amount of sugar in innocent smoothies. I don't know if that's changed now. But yeah, what about ones like that? I'm not going to call out the brand, but I just did. So. I'm not going to speak. I'm not going to speak negatively. One's like innocent, but it's definitely not innocent.
Well, yeah, let's say this. All smoothies are going to have sugar in them because fruit contains sugar. Yeah. So whether you make it yourself or whether you buy an innocent smoothie or any other brand, it's going to have the sugar in because it's the natural fructose that you get in sugar anyway, in fruit anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's good to know. In terms of one thing that is kind of hot on the agenda in our house at the moment is snacks. Like, if I don't go to nursery without a snack, there's turmoil. If I don't have a snack in the car, it's World War III. If I don't have a snack, just going to the park. Like, snacks. And my kind of worry around snacks is that if she has a taste of something that's really sweet, she gets hooked on them. Does it then spoil her appetite? So it kind of leads in. It's not just the impact of having that snack there and then, it's the impact 2 hours later when she then gets served up dinner and it's sad and it's not sweet. And what are your kind of thoughts around snacks and navigating that situation?
So in terms of how children develop, snacks are considered fun and something they like and something that's for me, whereas meals are considered not very nice and just for the grown-ups. So that's the thought process that's going through their mind. So children do prefer snacks. But often us as parents, if you think about it, we could give them a small version of a meal and call it a snack, but we don't. As parents, we tend to go for the things that they like. So the sweet stuff, the processed stuff that comes in a packet. And part of the reason why children like those sorts of foods is because they are exactly the same every time they have them. So whether you buy it, on a Tuesday in June or a Thursday in December, it's exactly the same. So it's predictable. And so they prefer those foods. There's nothing weird about them. So sometimes it's a little bit of how we've positioned snacks as parents, but also it's to do with their perception that snacks are good and fun, but meals are just for grown-ups.
I think so many parents fall into that trap as well. I know we have of almost trying to I don't say control behavior, but kind of reward certain behaviors with foods that aren't necessarily, the healthiest, and treats and snacks start to maybe pile up a little bit too much of the day. And that tends to then pull us very much off course, everything that you're saying. Um, so how can we healthily kind of introduce foods as a way of kind of positive reinforcement, I guess is my question, both in terms of the psychology of it, but also the nutrients that we're providing for our kids.
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of links into the snacks as well, actually. There, that having a routine or a rhythm, or I think a rhythm is a better word for it, for eating is really, really helpful for children. And we know that, breakfast, lunch and dinner is fairly given. Most people do that. But making sure that if there is a snack, it's kind of equally spaced in between one meal and the next, so that you might have like mid-morning snack at, say, 10:30 or something, and then you might have a mid-afternoon snack at 3:00. And what that does is it helps children from the psychology point of view, because they understand the rhythm. They know that food is coming. Some children can get quite anxious when they think that, there might not be something coming soon. So it really helps from that point of view. But also it teaches them about appetite regulation. So one of the things that we want our children to experience is feeling hungry, because they need to learn that actually that feeling that you get in your tummy, that sometimes it's not very nice, is hunger, and it goes away when you put food in. So it can be really helpful for them to just understand that feeling and know what it is, and that can help them grow up to essentially be intuitive eaters, so to eat in response to what their body's asking them to do.
Love that. So I'll stop leaving a trail of Maltesers towards the bath to get them to get in the bath. No.
Yeah. We used to do the same. We used to have chocolate buttons for getting in the car seat.
Yes, chocolate buttons, just perfect dimensions.
Because that's the easiest thing, isn't it? Like when you're getting a tantrum, the easiest thing to do as a parent is just to do that. And because sometimes taking the easy option, you're always kind of, but it's kind of nice at the same time to hear that all parents go through this. It's kind of how we cope with those stages.
There's a snack that I've recently discovered, which the children love, and I'm particularly pleased with myself about this, Sarah. Am I barking up the right tree by slicing up segments of apple and then smearing peanut butter on top?
Yeah, love it. Absolutely love it. That's great. And you know what's great about that is you've got two different food groups in there. You've got your protein and a bit of fat, actually, healthy fats from the peanut butter, and you've got your apple. And I often think, the best snack is where you've got different food groups represented, because you just provide them more nutrients. Yeah, love it.
Love that. Can we talk a little bit about breastfeeding? Is that okay?
Yeah.
And this is kind of just so I know a little bit more, and hopefully one day we have a bigger family and my wife has to breastfeed again. I was never really involved so much with this side of things. And I kind of think we started this to be able to give us tools as dads to help our partners. So when it comes to breastfeeding, are there any foods that our partners should avoid? Are there any foods that our partners, should focus on? Because I have read somewhere as well, I don't know how much truth there is to this. If your partner breastfeeds, if your wife breastfeeds, it does, when it comes to introducing allergens as well, there's less likelihood of them becoming allergic to things. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. So just to caveat this with, I'm not an adult nutrition expert, so I don't know a huge amount about breastfeeding nutrition, but I did breastfeed my own two children. And you're absolutely right that breastfeeding, because it's, as well as nutrition and fluid and all of that, because it passes on the immunity from mum to baby, there is a protective effect that goes with that. So when you come to weaning your baby and you're introducing those allergens, if you're breastfeeding at the same time, your baby has an extra level of protection. So we'd have seen reduced rates of allergies developing in children who are breastfed, and higher rates of allergies developing in children who are not breastfed. So you're absolutely right there.
Yeah, I guess to caveat that as well, I've seen firsthand how hard breastfeeding is.
Yes.
I know a lot of mums, it's just, it's a no-go area. So
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And as a pediatric nutritionist, my view is fed is best.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know.
And you mentioned weaning there. I'd love to kind of get into this kind of topic as well. And I just have these flashbacks again. This is again why I wish that we had this conversation 7 years ago. But the early years, and you're kind of going through this process of trying to introduce foods, and you've got the softer foods. We used to have those packets when we were out and about, and it was almost like you were saying, "Don't leave the house without snacks." We would not leave the house without those kind of pre-made packets, which we were trying to get, high quality, of course. Brands and well-made produce. What are your thoughts on those pre-made soft food packages for those kind of early years? Yeah, hit me with
Yeah.
it. I'm so fascinated by this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm always a food first person. So I think if you can cook from scratch, that's definitely the best way to go. But I'm also a parent and realistic, and I do see that there is a place for sometimes you don't have the time, or you're on holiday, or you're having your kitchen redone, or whatever, and you need to rely on pouches and jars and packets and things like that. One of the things I would say with the pouches in particular, actually, is decant them first into a pot or a container, and either feed your baby, with a spoon, or let them feed if they're capable of doing that. Because I focus quite a lot on fussy eating, and one of the things that is emerging now is fussy eaters who've never seen the food because it's gone straight from the pouch into their mouths
Yeah.
really, really struggle to eat that food later on.
Mm.
So, the classic one is broccoli. Parents can't get their child to eat broccoli, can't get their child to eat broccoli. And that's because as a baby, they only ever had broccoli in a pouch. So they don't know what this little tree thing is. So, and I think I mentioned earlier that, eating is a highly sensory experience. And actually, just seeing your food is the very first sensory box that they have to tick before then they can then move on through the other senses.
I like that. So I'm going to start leaving broccoli in Aurelia's bed.
Yes, just scatter it
So
everywhere.
it's just there. She's always aware of it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd also love to touch on, you mentioned supplements earlier and supplementation for children. I know that's such a broad topic, but obviously it sounds like it's something which you see a place for. And if so, what are those scenarios that it's relevant? And then what kind of supplementation do you tend to recommend in your field of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So all younger children should have a vitamin A, C, and D supplement. So that's kind of like a government blanket recommendation for all children. Vitamin D, because it comes from sunlight, and of course in the Northern Hemisphere we don't get enough of that. So even as adults, we should be taking that as well. And the A and C is because babies are learning how to eat, toddlers are a bit fussy, you can't guarantee that they're getting enough of that. Chances are they probably are. And actually, when I sit down and assess a child's diet, most of them are getting enough vitamin C and vitamin A. But at the moment, that the recommendation is for everyone to have those. In terms of other supplements, I wouldn't actually recommend other supplements unless there's a specific food or food group, I should say, that's been cut out of their diet. So, for example, if a child has a cow's milk protein allergy and can't eat any dairy foods, then we might be looking at what's missing. Can they get it from other foods? If they can't, okay, let's look for a supplement for that. Another one that we sometimes see is quite low in children's diets is the omega-3. So it's really present in oily fish. That's kind of the best source for it, because the form that's in oily fish is really well absorbed in the human body, whereas the forms that come from nuts and seeds and things isn't absorbed as well. So sometimes if children are just like fish haters or for whatever reason they're not eating fish, that's a one that we'll have a look at supplementing. But in the main, they don't need anything more complex than that, unless someone's looked at their diet, assessed it, and said, yeah, you've got this missing, try and replace it here.
So if a parent wants to have either that assessment or they suspect that they'd like to go for those blanket recommendations and supplementations, what are the first kind of steps parents could take to action that?
Yeah, so if they're really worried, they could go to the GP and ask for a referral to a dietitian. So free of charge on the NHS. Fairly long waiting lists, but they will get seen. Children are prioritised, so that would be the first way to go. If they're just a little bit concerned, then if they want, they can ask me. I'll happily have a quick chat with them and see what's what and give them advice if we need to. I've got quite a selection of blogs on my website, so if they wanted to just have a poke around there and get some information on nutrients and supplements, then that would be another option for people as well.
Amazing. What was because I know we'll discuss this at the end, but what was the name of your website, just again on the moment so everyone's clear?
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. It is childrensnutrition.co.uk.
Love it, thank you.
One thing I do want to, we're kind of at the stage at the moment where our daughter's 2.5. She's still guzzling a lot of milk.
Yeah.
When is kind of the age that children should be taken off of milk?
Okay. How much? How much is she taking? Just out of interest.
Well, she'll still have milk in the morning. I say guzzling, that's maybe a bit harsh, but she'll still have a bottle in the morning and like a bottle in the evening. But we've started to like dilute the bottle in the morning a little bit, just so she doesn't notice. She's so smart. She's like, this isn't proper milk.
What type of milk is it?
Cow's milk.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things here. So first of all, she probably shouldn't still be having the bottle. Okay. So if you can get her onto a cup, that's better for her development. It's for their oral motor development, really. So it helps with speech. Sometimes we find that teeth, if they're sucking through a teat, their teeth formation can be not what we want it to be. So I would definitely try and move her onto a cup if you can. And what we tend to find is when children have to drink from a cup.
Sorry, it's not like a bottle like we did in the first stages. It is very much like one of the toddler. I don't know what do you call it. It is a bottle. It's not like the ones that you use straight away.
It's like the hard one with like the holes in the ends that you can kind of pour. So it hasn't got like the teat, the squishy.
It hasn't got the teat. Yeah.
Okay, so if you tipped it upside down, it would just flow out.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, they're much better. Yeah, so that's fine.
Yes,
that's
good.
You were sweating for a second
I had
there.
to really think about that. And I was like, what on earth?
Yeah, they're absolutely fine, and they're great because there's no mess. So I like those. But milk. I often think milk is a food, although it's a liquid. Think of it as a food because it's highly nutritious. It's got fat, it's got protein, it's got loads of energy, and it can fill up little tummies quite quickly. And because they've got quite small stomach capacities when they're little, it can get in the way of food. So sometimes we see children who still have quite a lot of milk. They'll have milk in preference to food, and that's when we can sometimes see things like iron deficiency happening. That's what happened to my fussy eater when he was quite little, and that was down to milk as well, actually, just preferred milk. And milk, it's comforting. They've had it since they were tiny. They used to get a lovely cuddle when they had milk when they were really little, and it's easy. You don't have to chew. You just put it in your mouth and swallow, and it's in there. So it's you can see how it really is a preferred food for young children, but it doesn't necessarily help them move on. So in terms of a volume, I would say at her age, you probably want her to be having about 350, maximum 400 mils in a day. So what's that? About 2/3 of a pint.
Right. Okay.
If it's any more than that, that's when nutrients can be displaced from not getting enough of food.
Okay.
It's one of my grandparents. So my parents, my children's grandparents, one of the favorite things to do when they go back and visit them in Wales, there's it's called the milk shed, and it's the farmers set it up, and it's a go and help yourself milk, and you get to squeeze in all the different milkshake flavorings as well, or you just have it kind of completely natural, and then or you can make it some real neon light color, which obviously I don't do, of course. There's an option, but they're 7 and 5, and they'll still, instead of there'll be a day where they go to the pub for a pint, but right now it's off to the milkshake for a big bottle of milk. I love it.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, milk is an amazing food. It's really, really nourishing for children. So if there are kids that don't like milk, that can be a problem as well, if they don't get enough of it.
I would also love to explore, and again, this is one of the big topics that we've already touched on elements of it, but I want to delve a bit deeper into the impact of food on behaviors. Everyone knows about the impact of sugar on child's behaviors. This is particularly interesting to a lot of parents who are kind of trying to navigate all of the different developmental stages and everything else that comes with it. Is there any advice on any particular foods? And again, feel free to touch on sugar as well, because I know that is obviously the big one, but are there any other macro and micronutrient groups or areas that we should be aware of when it comes to giving our children the best foods in order to help their development or explore their developments with regards to their behaviors?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is really topical at the minute, isn't it? And people are talking about whether food is linked to ADHD and other behaviors, and I think what's really important for people to know is actually there's no evidence for that at all. ADHD in particular is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's a change in the brain, and we've got no evidence at all to say that that's related to what you eat or how you've been fed or anything like that. So there are some foods that are thought to be linked to behavior. I say thought because the evidence is not there. This is a lot of it's anecdotal, or when research has been done for every trial that says, yes, this definitely causes certain behaviors, there's another one that says, actually, no, it doesn't. So the ones that we are aware of are things like your additives or your E numbers. So colors, yellows, some of the reds, some of the preservatives have been linked to things like hyperactivity. But again, the research is really inconclusive. So I think one of the things I would say about if you're concerned about additives is it's totally safe to have a child on a diet that doesn't contain any additives and not have any nutritional worries at all. So, if it's something that parents want to try, crack on, absolutely fine. There are things like caffeine. So caffeine is often in a lot of children's foods, mainly in the form of chocolate, but, Coke, cola, even some of the teas that children have got caffeine in them. And children, they have the similar sort of effects that we do when we haven't had caffeine, but it's much more enhanced in children. So they can have things like agitation, anxiety. Obviously, it affects their sleep. So that's one I would say just to be mindful of. And then sugar. Yeah, sugar's a classic one, isn't it? Sugar. And actually, it's not just sugar, it's the unrefined carbohydrates as well. So things like white bread, for example, processed white bread. And the reason for this is because it doesn't take very much for that sugary food or the white bread or whatever to be broken down in the body. So it can send the blood sugars. It's just a spike essentially in blood sugars. And because it doesn't last very long, it crashes quite quickly as well. But some children are sensitive to that and others, it doesn't affect them at all. So I don't think we can say with any concrete proof that, yes, there are foods that cause behavior issues in children. But, with sugar and refined carbs, there are more unrefined versions, and it's not going to do any harm if children don't have any sugar. With the E numbers, like I said, it's not going to do any harm if they don't have that. They shouldn't be having caffeine anyway, really. So I don't see any problem in parents wanting to cut these things out just to give it a try and see if it does improve behavior.
It's very interesting. Specifically, my parents told me when I was younger, I was slightly old, I was maybe, I don't know, early teens, that if I had Fanta orange, I would go very weird, apparently. Specifically, only ever Fanta orange.
Drunk a lot of it,
yeah. But it's funny, you mentioned the iced tea as well. Sometimes I'm partial to a kombucha. Which is fermented tea, and the kids are coming over trying to have some of that, and I'm like, you mustn't have any of this, it's got caffeine in it. It's one of those kind of drinks that we consider to be healthy, but only for adults. Am I right in considering that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, particularly with something like caffeine, the reason why that children get different effects than we do is because they're just smaller. So, they're getting the same amount of caffeine that we would have, but they're much smaller people. And so they get a much greater response to that caffeine in their bodies.
And the half-life of caffeine, is it like it stays in your system? Is it like up to 6 hours afterwards as well? Is that right?
Yeah, so it's very dependent on the person. So, and it's a lot of it's to do with your DNA and how fast you can metabolize it. But I think, if you Googled it, the average would be 4 to 6 hours.
Okay.
You mentioned DNA there. I wanted to ask you about genetics and food, and again exploring that genetics and nutrition. Is it a thing? First of all, if we can explore that, and if so, how can we look out for our children's individual needs on that basis?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an emerging thing. Personalized nutrition, that's something that is being talked about more and more and researched more and more. And I personally have had my nutritional DNA analyzed, which has been fascinating. And I have to say, the report that came back was spot on, absolutely accurate. Things like my caffeine clearance, and I now know how long it takes me. I can't drink coffee after midday, otherwise I'll be up, all night. Things like alcohol clearance. So it's been very, very enlightening to read these reports. The research has only ever been done in adults, and actually because of that, these tests that you can have done are not licensed in children anyway. But what you could do, I suppose, is both parents could have that done, and you would know that actually your child is going to be a combination of the two of those, or likely to be. But yeah, I think it's an area to watch out for. It's definitely emerging, and I think, as I said at the start, I've been a pediatric dietitian for 25 years, and what's the diplomatic way of saying this? I don't honestly believe that there's a one size fits all approach, and that is the standard advice that's given out a lot of the time. So yeah, watch this space with personalized nutrition.
Oh, it's fascinating because I, as an adult, honestly, I feel like, I'm 40 now. I feel like it took me 30 years of trial and error and research to find the foods that fit for me. I have actually also had, the DNA testing as well in recent years. But I feel like, again, like I used to play loads of sport, for instance, as an example, in my teenage years. And I used to do a lot of the carb loading with, the pasta the night before. And then I would feel like in a kind of mental haze the next day, and then it many years later realized that wasn't the right thing for me. But it's trial and error, and it's obviously early in our children's kind of exploration of that.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And did you find that your DNA report was accurate compared to how you feel as a person who eats food?
I did in many regards. Yeah.
Yeah.
That I had certain sensitivities which make sense, and I've naturally gravitated away from, because I'm leaning
Yes.
more towards the foods that make me feel good, of course.
Yeah,
But
brilliant.
I find it fascinating. It's a fascinating area to look into. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
So when I said that you were coming on, I put a poll up and I had loads of people send questions in. Now, I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have time to go through all of them, or maybe if we do, you kind of just answer them as kind of precisely or as quickly as you can. But
Okay.
so the first question that we had was best approach to weaning. I know we've kind of spoke about this previously at the start, but yeah, any tips around weaning?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two main approaches are purees or baby-led weaning. And actually, what I often say to parents is, your baby will tell you. You'll go in with an idea of how you want to do it, but actually, often babies on purees refuse to spoon, and baby-led weaning babies just don't eat anything. So I would just go with what your baby wants to do. They'll tell you. And my view is a combination of the two is probably the best approach, because they learn all of the skills.
Great. Love that. Next, how to make food fun for toddlers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on this a little bit already, haven't we? But story and imagination, that's key. Making it look nice, making it smell nice, making it taste nice. And once you've got that, they've got a much better chance that they'll eat it.
Great. Love this. My son only eats like 5 things. It's been forever. How do I get him to eat more?
Okay. So what I would say here is you need to find out why. So again, we've touched earlier on the sensory side of things, and we've also touched on the psychology side of things and how children learn. But until you know why you'll only eat 5 things, it's going to be really hard because like all things in medicine, you need to find out why in order to treat it appropriately. What I would say though to this parent is 5 foods is a bit of a red flag. I often say that if they're eating less than 20 foods, that's when you need to go and get some professional support. 5, I would be really worried about their nutrition, so definitely go and get some help.
Okay, so the person that did leave that comment urged them to get in touch with you after this.
Yes, they can do that. That's fine. Yeah.
Great. Are processed fruit treats like fruit winders even healthy?
No,
Like
they're
what?
just sweets in disguise.
Winders. Yes. Sorry. Took me a while.
No, they are just sweets. So the fruit puree, loads and loads and loads and loads of sugar. So I would say they're just sweets in disguise.
So they put the word fruit, and so they get you, and it's like, oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Best way to get toddlers to eat new foods.
Okay, so how you parent around food is the key here, really. So we've touched on the rhythm for eating, sharing a meal together, respecting each other's roles. So parents are in charge of the menu, of deciding what's on offer rather than asking children what they want for their dinner. But then letting the child decide if they're going to eat, sometimes they won't, and how much, so that they're not being encouraged to eat. And the other thing that really helps there, and again, I think we said it earlier on, is to just check your expectation. So things like, children are learning. There are going to be days when they're not eating well. They're not going to sit at the table for more than 10 minutes because they want to be off doing something else. So yeah, just bear that in mind as well.
Yeah, this is great, Sarah. If my child doesn't eat before bed, will they be hungry?
Possibly. It depends on how well they've eaten throughout the rest of the day. If it's been a bit of a food disaster, then yes. But actually, children are really, really good at making up for missed nutrients. So quite often, if you've got that rhythm, that schedule in place, if they don't eat well one day, they will the next. They're really quite intuitive when they're little.
Okay. My son will only eat with an iPad. Any help to make it easier?
That's
is
a
one
good
we
one.
haven't really
Oh,
touched
that's
on.
such a good
is
one.
Like food.
Yeah.
Food technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, again, I would want to know why. So sometimes children who really, really struggle with eating, like maybe from a sensory perspective, zone out, and they need something like an iPad just to, in order to be able to get the food in the first place. So if this parent suspects there's something else going on there, get some help with that. If it's because they've been conditioned to eat with an iPad because maybe it was easier when parents were trying to finish off their work or whatever through the day. We need to uncondition them, or we need to change those psychological cues, because essentially this little one has probably just learned you don't eat food unless you've got an iPad. So we just need to change that for them. So it's around that environment again, changing the environment. What I would say is if you take the iPad away and they start having huge meltdowns, that's probably linking back to the reason why they've got the iPad in the first place. So that might just be another little red flag about maybe needing some help with that.
I like that. Do you know, as it's getting a little bit warmer now, I ate with my daughter outside the other day, and the difference of eating outside, wow. Just like taking everything in, it was so much easier.
Yeah. And that's those cues again, isn't it? You've changed up the cues associated with eating. So there's going to be a whole different eating experience when you eat outside.
Yeah, I'm going to get her on the Barbie this week. Well, not this
week.
Teddy Bear's picnics, here we come.
And lastly, again, we have kind of touched on this, but why does eating cause so many meltdowns?
Yeah, I thought this was a really, really interesting one, because a meltdown is actually a sign that a child is in distress. So usually what it would tell me is that they're highly, highly anxious, and it may well be because they've learned that meal times are quite unpleasant because they're always being asked to eat, or they've been told they have to try something and they don't want to. Or, they may have a meltdown because they're relying on that crutch, that iPad, and you take it away and then the meltdown happens. So essentially, these are almost like avoidance behaviors. So if there's a meltdown, it means that the mealtime's really quite stressful for them. So I'd maybe ask this parent just to take a look at what's happening at the mealtime, and can they change things around to make it a bit calmer, a bit nicer, a bit more engaging for the child.
Love that. That is absolutely brilliant. Do you have anything else?
No, I just like wish I had this conversation. I wish I could listen to this podcast 7 years ago, Sarah.
That's
This is
what we're here
amazing.
for
Thank
now.
you.
So one thing we always like to kind of close the episode on is we always ask, what is the best and worst parenting advice that you've ever been given?
Ooh, worst bit of parenting advice, and it links into food, I've ever been given, is they'll eat when they're hungry. Some children don't, and in fact my two wouldn't have done. They would have ended up on tube feeds if I just let them let them starve. So I think that's the worst bit I've been given. Best bit,
Tricky one, this, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
it really is tricky. Yeah. I think it's got to be around something around understanding them as humans in their own right, with their own opinions, their own views on things, and respecting that, validating their feelings. So, linking it back into food, if they do have issues with certain foods, or tell you it looks like dog poo or whatever, understanding why, and like really validating that feeling that they've got going, and that empathy really helps that relationship between the two of you build.
Yeah, I love that. Because part of us are so like conditioned that we should all be the same, we should all think the same, we should all eat the same, we should all fall in love with the same activities, but we're all so unique and different in our own.
Yeah, totally. And again, that is a point that's popped up a few times with some guests that we've had about, avoiding this trap of trying to enforce our will upon our children according to our conditioning or how we were brought up, but being able to just hold that space for them as humans, as their own individuals, to explore and nurture themselves. And
totally.
I think when it comes to food, I mean, that's the ultimate, I think. Yeah, love
absolutely. And so lastly, just before we go, I came across you on Instagram. I know you give loads of helpful tips and advice, and you work with your own clients online. Where is the best place for people to reach out to you? Is it through Instagram or through your website?
Yeah, either or. So I am the Children's Nutritionist on Instagram, and the website is childrensnutrition.co.uk.
Sorry, we just froze there. So sorry, Sarah. Do you mind repeating that? Sorry.
Certainly, yeah. So I am the Children's Nutritionist on Instagram, and the website is childrensnutrition.co.uk, and there's absolutely tons of blogs on there. That's how I started the business, actually, as a blog. So there's absolutely tons of advice and support and tips and stuff. Really, just because there's not a lot of information out there, or I should say there's not a lot of the right information out there. So that was why I created it, to be able to help as many parents as possible.
I love that. Yeah, because you kind of just expected to just like to know all these things, and what better place to go than to reach out to you, Sarah. So we really hope that people have found this helpful, enlightening, informative, and we cannot thank you enough, Sarah. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Cheers. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
The Secret Life of Dad.